It's been a good year. This is my third year doing these wrap-up videos. Doing it a little bit early this year because I'm about to embark on the 100 book challenge. The timing kind of coincides to clear the table. So here we are. We're doing it tier rank style because that's my fetish now. These are not chronological, it's just whatever order the tier ranker put them in. This is Reader's Guide to Science Fiction, published 1986. And it's a prospectus of, I hope that's the right word, the prospectus. Gives short bios of the most well-known, most influential science fiction writers to that time. Found some interesting tidbits in there. It put me onto some people that I wasn't as familiar with. Unfortunately, the authors, or at least one of them, there were 3 of them, had a tendency / had tendencies to spoil a lot of the books that they described, so reader be warned. Jeanette Winterson's The Stone Gods is also B. This is from the early 90s. You can tell it's from the early 90s. I really like Winterson. I have a lot of respect for Winterson, and when she is excellent, she is excellent. She is first class, A+. However, this is pretty disjointed. Deals with questions around consciousness and personhood with robotics that by the early 90s had become fairly trite. It's written episodically and non-linearly. It's stylistically actually pretty close to what Malzberg does. Thematically, it's kind of closer to Joanna Russ. Those are 2 big, heavy-hitting names that I'm invoking for Jeanette Winterson, and I think that she earns those comparisons, but she unfortunately, at least in this, just is not as good of a genre writer as either of them. All the Stars of Stage by Blish is a C. It starts out promisingly. Starts off as a satire of gender politics in the late 60s, early 70s, and then gets into some really like stale space opera. There are some interesting ideas in there. There's some good characters, and then I think the milk curdles around halfway through. Gypsy by Carter Scholz was a surprising book. This is the only book that I've read from him. I tried Palimpsests that he co-wrote with someone else and did not care for it at all. This book is excellent. If you're into hard science fiction, then I think you would resonate with this, especially if you're into Peter Watts. He writes in a way that's a little more accessible than Watts. It's less dense, but it has his despairing perspective and hard-bitten satirical edge. Effective story, maybe want to read more from Scholz. Demolished Man by Bester. B for Bester. I haven't covered this here on YouTube yet. This is one that I shot a review for on Patreon. I do individual reviews of each book that I read in long form. These days, it averages like 20 to 30 minutes per video, and I do extras, talk about the movies that I watch and the music that I listen to. It's $5 if I can entice you over to the Patreon side of things. Obviously a famous book, one that you've probably heard of above and beyond these obscurities. I don't like it as much as Stars My Destination. I think it traffics way too much in Freudian psychoanalytic terminology. Of course, it is from 1953, so it would make sense that a psychological science fiction novel of that time would have that flavor, but it's a flavor that I don't like. Like when I was a kid, I ate too many Necco wafers all at once and vomited, and I haven't had a Necco wafer since. I'm kind of getting that way with a couple of things in genre lit. Freudian and Jungian psychoanalytic terms are one of those tropes that it just makes my skin crawl. Fingernails on a chalkboard to me. Obviously mileage will vary. It's a mix of crime fiction and science fiction. It's a whodunit where the investigator, the cop in the cops and robbers equation, knows that the robber is the robber, or in this case, the murderer is the murderer. So it's more legal procedural or a detective story about him trying to pin this guy down with enough evidence to convict him in a future where public and private life are really influenced by the presence of professional psychics. And there's a corporate war between 2 big conglomerates, and the head of one of them murders the head of another one. I'm really not spoiling anything. There's a detail in there between a couple of the characters that is like absolutely, unequivocally just freakish and weird about mental regression. Really, really weird stuff. I don't know, it just didn't quite click with me. I know that it's a classic, but this is not on my Mount Rushmore. Mama Black Widow by Iceberg Slim, also an A, also a truly hair-raising, harrowing book. This is not genre fiction. It is about a black family of sharecroppers who move from the South to Chicago during the Great Migration and have their lives just torn apart by poverty. One of the most brutal, violent, and disturbing books that I've ever touched. And Iceberg Slim, whose real name was Robert Beck, is not really talked about, I don't think, or at least I don't typically hear him talked about as a great literary figure, someone with like hardcore top-shelf literary chops, but I think that he should be, based only on this one book. This is all that I've read from him. It's one of the most moving, and I think I used the word harrowing before already. I'll use it again. Double harrowing, this book. In certain senses, it has aged strangely. In others, it is a book out of time. The protagonist is described as a drag queen, and the portrayal really touched me in its empathy. Snail on a Slope by the Strugatsky brothers, I will also give an A. This is the most challenging, technically, science fiction book I've ever read. If you like Roadside Picnic, I would, you know, step foot into this one, but your shoe might plunge over its top into the mud, muck, and mire of their strange, symbolic, and impenetrable at times writing. In large part, it's a satire of Soviet bureaucracy. In large part, also, it's a satire of who the hell knows. It's allegory for something. If you start reading it and you just are scratching your head, you have no idea what's going on, skip to the back if you're reading the SF Masterworks and read the afterword written by Boris, where he lays out the actual meaning or a big chunk of the meaning of the book. I don't think you should worry about spoilers. I think if you're just banging your head against the wall trying to figure out what this book is, I would just read that bit. It does elucidate a lot of what's happening. If you're into weird fiction, if you like Annihilation by Vandermeer, I think this also might scratch the itch. Even though it was so frustrating and challenging, or maybe because it was so frustrating and challenging, I found it a very rewarding reading experience. Our first S tier, The Continuous Katherine Mortenhoe by D.G. Compton. This has an alternate title, The Unsleeping Eye. This is one of my to spoil the next top 15. This is, I'm planning already for this to be on the next top 15. This is a complete Hall of Famer. It's about a media company exploiting this chronically ill woman to be the subject of something like a reality television show. This was written in the 70s. And there's an evolving relationship between her and herself and her illness, an evolving consciousness of herself as subject, and a simultaneous evolving consciousness of the journalist who is tasked with filming her through implanted cameras in his eyeballs that she doesn't know about. Outside of its metaphorical potency, it also is gorgeous. Compton is an incredible writer. I said in the last tier video that I think Compton is the best character writer in all of genre fiction. If you haven't read Compton, I would say probably this one, and also because it's easier to find than Farewell, Earth's Bliss, which is also excellent. The Color of Distance by Amy Thomson, pretty long, hard SF, biological SF novel from the early 90s. It's not all that well known. I thought that it was decent. The characterization I think is a little bit weak. It is a little bit overlong, but the ideas in it, the world building in it is really good. It's about a human explorer to this alien world that's like a rainforest world peopled with a sapient sort of frog species that communicates only visually, so they have a language based on colors and shapes that they display on their skin, and they transform her after a crash into something like a halfway between a Homo sapiens and whatever this alien species is. They outfit her with a lot of the same hardware, biological hardware that they have, and she learns how to, you know, integrate into their culture and to communicate with the skin. There's some really amazing, like, great moments in it. The literary quality is sort of just okay, and the plot is pretty slow, but overall, nice little sleeper, hard SF book that I thought was pretty good. The Abominable Snowmen by what's his face? Who is this guy? Eric Norman. I have an abiding interest in the Sasquatch question. One could say, I'm on the record multiple times as saying that I think it's more likely to be an actual animal than to be something else. I've taken heat for that over the years, but I still basically feel that way. And also I like to collect these old Bigfoot books because they're not that common. I found this actually in Thailand while I was traveling, and it's a big pile of shit. There's a bunch of stuff in there that's just completely fabricated. It's all fabricated, Matt. Agree to disagree. This is especially pulpy and sensationalist, and I did mail it home ultimately because it's kind of a scarce book, but I would not recommend reading it. The Forever War. I hadn't read it since I was a teenager, and it had a lot more issues than I remember. The big one, I think, is the plot is segmented into 3 acts in my memory. The first act is incredible. It's excellent. The other 2 are not as good. I would say the middle one, which is this slightly corny dystopian writing, is the worst. The wrapping up is a little lacking, I think, in the anti-war punch that this book is renowned for. The stuff with the time dilation is excellent. That's one of the best part. That's probably the best part. The Freeze Frame Revolution by Peter Watts. It's going to be a crowded booth here, I think. It's a hard science novella that is a midpoint in a sequence of short stories that Watts wrote around this idea of, there's this recurrent trope in science fiction of the warp gates staged throughout space, but no one had written the book of who put up those warp gates and why, and what would life have been like for those people. There is a colony ship of technicians and scientists who are seeding those warp gates, but in order to bridge the vast distances between intervals, they have to go into cryosleep. And their lives in the cryosleep process are managed by an AI referred to endearingly by the crew as the chimp, and the chimp goes bad. So what would you do if you had to mount a resistance to an all-seeing AI that wished you ill if you were scheduled to go back into cryosleep periodically and you couldn't communicate your intentions to the other people on the ship? Very, very cool premise. It gets bogged down in exposition, which tends to happen in hard SF generally and can tend to happen with Watts. And Watts has a really acidic writing style that worked really well in Blindsight. I don't think that it worked as well here. He Died with His Eyes Open by Derek Raymond. I've talked about this a few times. This is still my favorite piece of crime fiction. Described it as existentialist crime fiction. Some really gorgeous writing in this. Lem's Eden. An all-fellas team of scientists land on an alien world. If you've read The Invincible, it's a lot like The Invincible. I think that this one is better. This isn't one of his more famous books. Certainly not as good as Solaris, but has a moral quality to it, a philosophical edge that I think is kind of up there with Solaris, even though the reading experience isn't as gratifying. And Lem made this up as he went along. He didn't have a plot outline, and you can kind of tell it feels rather aimless at times, but it ends up in a good place, posing pretty tough moral questions with a lot of creepy atmosphere. The Prone Gunman is another crime novel. Both of these were recommended to me by Sean of SF Ultra. I describe this as like reading a John Wick movie. Better than the John Wick movies. It's about a hired assassin doing one last job, pursuing a youthful love interest with a sort of emotional innocence and immaturity that's played for black comedy against his incredibly, like, spectacularly violent impulses. Short book, easy read, and pretty gripping. I liked it. The Reefs of Earth by R.A. Lafferty, I adore, I adore. Very, very, very good chance this winds up on the next top 15. It is a book written by the guy who did Past Master, which is itself an incredible book. I like this a lot more. It's like a science fiction, fantasy, horror, Great Depression, Steinbeck, Faulkner novel about a family of aliens who are poor mimics of human beings who live in a town in the South or in the Midwest somewhere. And all the human inhabitants of this town have clocked them as aliens and live in fear of them because they produce what is called a Baggerthash Vance, an improvised poem that's like a spell that dooms its subject to an inevitable fate if it's performed in the right way. The children of this family have murderous intentions towards the villagers. So there's a three-part conflict between the elder aliens, the child aliens, and the humans. The writing is almost indescribable. It's so good. It's so rich and inventive, plays off of itself, seemingly just in this almost free associative state, but all in service of this grander vision that Lafferty had, tying in a lot of allusions to Native American mythology and allegory around the treatment of the Native Americans. My immediate first association while reading this was with Book of the New Sun. I like this more than anything that I've read from Wolfe. Eric John Stark, Outlaw of Mars by Leigh Brackett, who is most remembered for writing the screenplay for Empire Strikes Back. This is her spin on Sword and Planet, planetary romance, sword and sorcery, lit. It is a way above the average of most sword and sorcery stuff or stuff in that pulpy part of genre fiction that I have come across. This is two novellas. Both of them are excellent. The second one is great. Hard to Be a God by the Strugatskys is their action movie book. It is the most accessible, I would say, probably the least difficult, the least thorny of the material that I've read from them. It's not my favorite Strugatsky, but it's the Strugatskys. So it's good. I have not seen the movie. I know that I should see the movie. I have not seen the movie. It's about an intergalactic intelligence agency trying to maintain political neutrality on this alien world where things are sort of like stuck at this medieval stage of development. There's a big political upheaval that challenges that neutrality, and what will they do? Will they intervene? Will they remain neutral? Good book. Wreath of Stars by Bob Shaw. I will give a B. Bob Shaw is a decent writer. I think this is the least favorite of his books that I've read. It's about a neutrino planet that collides with the Earth and leaves a certain residue behind. It's sort of a ghost story, a little bit of political commentary about post-colonial Africa. Some of it gets a little uncomfortable, but overall pretty good. I found it slightly predictable, and it lacked the snap and the verve and the beauty of Shaw's other work that I think makes it really special. Space Merchants is also a B. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of Bs. Very famous book, very important book from the early 50s from Kornbluth and Pohl. I think Kornbluth's solo work is better than this. That's another book that in some ways has aged beautifully well, and in others really reads like a book from the early 50s. Some of the satire does not land anymore, at least not for me. I don't know, there just wasn't a whole lot there. The stuff that was in there that I thought was great was, I think, Kornbluth being a weirdo. Other than that, I didn't really connect with it. Inverted Worlds by Christopher Priest, also probably going to be on the next Top 15 video. I've described this a couple of times as being a flawless book. There's nothing that I can point to in it that I dislike. That includes the ending. That is, it splits people's opinions. I think the ending is perfectly fine. Does everything right. Hard science, soft science, everything in between, characterization, plot. It's just great, eminently readable, smart, snappy. This is one of the few science fiction books that really might be for everybody who has an interest in science fiction. Salt is Adam Roberts' first novel. It's the only Adam Roberts novel that I have read. If you're into The Dispossessed by Le Guin, you'll probably like this. I thought this hit a lot of the satire right in the center of the bullseye. There's a lot in there that I think is incredibly smart. I think that this foresaw a lot of stuff that was to follow in the Bush era. Been a while since I read Dispossessed, but based on my memory, I think that's still a better book, but worthy successor. Fire Upon the Deep, I just went into this in depth. I'm not gonna say much new about this that I didn't say in the other one. Puppies of Terra by Thomas M. Dish. Another weird book. It falls all the way apart after the first third or half. He gets so lazy as a writer that he breaks the fourth wall to wink at you, to bring you in on the joke of how lazy he is being as a writer, and isn't it funny that he's sort of wasting your time. First half is pretty good. It's about an alien invasion, sort of a spin on Childhood's End, where the aliens are a lot more overweening and possessive, turn human beings into these willing, sycophantic, kind of quizzling pets who refer to themselves as dogs or puppies or something, who are kept on what are called leashes, which are tendrils of the aliens themselves, who are these vaporous cloud entities who use us as entertainment. Great premise, execution lacking in spots. Book of the New Sun, once again, I'm putting it at B because well, for a couple reasons. One, I'm too dumb to get it. Also because I'm a lazy reader. And also because I'm a literary hipster and contrarian, and I'm doing it for sport. Kafka's America is his first novel. It was never completed. It's the most straightforward, the most like mimetic of Kafka's novels. It's my least favorite of his material, but that is saying essentially nothing because Kafka, to this day, I think probably is my favorite writer. It's about a young man, like late adolescent, early adult, fleeing his European family to America in light of a scandal. And through a sequence of episodes that sort of rhyme with one another, he is exposed to the American dream and then disillusioned. Played at times for comedy, at times not. I think it's great. It's Kafka, of course, it's great. Space Prison by Tom Godwin is a pulp novel about a colony of humans who are taken captive by hostile aliens, exiled to this hostile alien world where they have to rebuild technology in anticipation of a possible return of the aliens after the passage of many, many, many generations. Cool premise. Some of the opening action when they get to the planet is pretty great. They're marauded by these killer, like, panther alien things. They're killed by these cat creatures and they die to exotic diseases and the elements, and it's just this crazy bloodbath. Some of that stuff is fun. The rest of it really sort of dumb to me. I don't know. I didn't really connect with this so well. Fury by Kuttner, very good book. I compare this actually very favorably to the Bester novels. Clearly, I think it's better than Demolished Man. I would need to reread Stars My Destination. I might actually end up liking this one more. The characterization is very close. Gully Foyle, the sort of half unsympathetic anti-hero character, Machiavellian and selfish and violent. A lot of similar characterization here. It also reminded me quite a bit, actually, of the Death World novels. This is better. Also, this is co-written with C.L. Moore. She says that she wrote about 10% of this material. She did punch up. Let's close those blinds. No, I'm just gonna look weird. I'm bathed in golden light. I am an ascended one. It's about a power struggle between an aristocracy that rules these underwater domed cities and the people. Exceptionally strong writing for that period of time. Ending's really good. I don't really have to say much that's all that critical. The Worm, Ouroboros, by E.R. Edison is a pre-Tolkien fantasy derived mostly from pagan or non-Christian sources of myth. In some senses, I like it more than Lord of the Rings. There's stuff in here that's not in there. There's sex in this. I think that the characters are, in some senses, more believable. Certainly the female characters seem more realistic in this than in Lord of the Rings. It's about a war between two kingdoms, Demon Land and Witch Land, who may or may not be supernatural entities, but are basically just described as people. The demons have horns, but it's only mentioned one time and then never again, and they live on Mercury. The stage setting action rules. It includes a pro wrestling match That's one of my favorite scenes I've ever read in a fantasy book. I couldn't believe that it was in there. It kicks ass. It gets pretty dull. It's also written in a way that I think will be alienating to almost everybody. It's like reading Shakespeare without aid of translation or clarification. However, in parts, surprisingly gruesome. Other sections of it, descriptions of landscape, philosophical musing, beautiful, gorgeous prose. Other parts, long sections of it, punishingly dull. Long book, interesting book. I think I recommend it. We'll actually skip over Philosopher's Stone to talk about this one. Mistress of Mistresses, also by E.R. Edison, is the first of the Zimiamvia, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, trilogy that followed from this, loosely in the same world. Even less happens in this than in this. The plot is pretty similar. This is more spiritual musings about big existential questions around eternal life and art and love, God and man. This is even more dialogue heavy than this. Less happens. The characters are more forgettable for the most part. But the sections of it that are good are amazing. I am full-on Seraphim mode. Look at this. I hope that doesn't look too crazy. I am not motivated to go on and read the rest of the Zimiamvia books. It was a struggle to get through it, but it's buoyed and redeemed by some passages of it that are just amazing. Philosopher's Stone by Colin Wilson, I gotta say, still D. I've talked about this in great detail. Feelings about this are pretty negative. We Can Build You by Philip K. Dick is one of his potboiler novels. He wrote prodigiously, as did most of the writers from his period. Produced some not so great work. This is one of those pieces of not so great work. Some bits of this are pretty funny. Some of the writing is truly god-awful, and there's a romance in here that I think is one of the worst I've ever read. Garments of Sand or Cain by Barrington J. Bailey. I don't really remember that much about. It sort of has the feel of a Bester novel, or maybe this. It's a pretty decent space opera about an alien suit, an outfit that gives its wearer certain abilities. I really remember very little about this other than I thought it was decent. Traveler in Black by Brunner, I was not as sweet on. Much prefer Stand on Zanzibar to this. This gets pretty redundant. It's about a mysterious wanderer who's an agent of cosmic power, teaching human beings in this fantasy Earth valuable life lessons that happens to be the same lesson over and over and over again, punishing people for their hubris by granting them a wish and then making their wish come literally true in the way that it's worded. It's not super fair to criticize it for being redundant in retelling this fable over and over because these are short stories. However, reading them all back to back gets pretty boring. Lilith by George MacDonald. Another B. George MacDonald is another pre-Tolkien writer who, unlike Edison, is very much a Christian writer, was very much a Christian writer, but he was borderline a Christian heretic, I think. He was exiled from his order for holding the belief that all people inevitably would find salvation because of the loving nature of God. I think I'm doing that justice. Hopefully I'm doing that justice. But he was a mentor to C.S. Lewis, and if you like the Narnia books, I think that you might like Lilith. It's about a guy who inherits a country estate that includes this massive library. He's reading in his library and he sees a vision of an old man who leads him up into the attic, and through a mirror, in this mirrorverse, the old man now appears as a talking raven. And this guy goes on journeys trying to pin down how the world works, how it relates to his own reality, and tries to play a constructive role in a spiritual battle between good and evil that is afoot. Pretty weird book. It gets religiously a bit didactic towards the end, but it hits that note of the ethereal weirdness and beauty that I like in this older fantasy. Feast Unknown by Farmer, I'll give a C. It's a pastiche erotica about Tarzan and Doc Savage renamed and slightly recharacterized. The premise here is that those characters are based on real people, and that this book is about those two real men who are thrust into a struggle for dominance as these icons of extreme hypermasculinity. It's meant allegedly as a satire of the homoerotic undertones of some of this men's adventure pulp stuff. The violence in this is too much to describe explicitly on YouTube. The sex content in it, again, way too hardcore to describe in a YouTube video. And I don't know that it rises above that. I know that you know, there's all this literary illusion in it, but the final result just felt a little edgelordy to me, and it felt kind of uninteresting, sort of stunty. I don't know, I didn't really connect with it. Every Man for Himself and God Against All by Werner Herzog. Ooh, this hurts, but apparently I'm giving it a B. I really like Werner Herzog. If you've heard Werner Herzog lectures, if you've heard Werner Herzog interviews, if you've seen a bunch of Werner Herzog films, I don't think that you need to read this book, because it's Herzog regurgitating a lot of Herzogianisms and leaning into them and self-mythologizing. There is interesting biographical background about his childhood growing up in Bavaria that actually reads like fantasy, because technology in that part of the world when he was growing up was so relatively primitive. It was like he grew up in the 1800s, and also because he embellishes, we'll say, or hyperbolizes, or just makes shit up potentially about characters in his village. But that part of the book is really wonderful and really beautiful, and Herzog is such a good writer. The writing is very, very good. If he didn't get as caught up in being Werner Herzog, I think that this would have been a better book. I definitely don't think that it's a bad book. Concrete Islands by J.G. Ballard is excellent. It's the middle book in the Urban Disaster trilogy that goes Crash, Concrete Islands, High Rise. I like High Rise a little more than this. It's about a white-collar guy in London who drives off of a highway median. And he's trapped in this area, this triangular area that's sort of overgrown, and there's many layers of disused, abandoned buildings from different periods of London's history. And he has to try to find a way to survive or to be rescued. Smaller scale than High Rise, and its scope of interests is a little bit unusual for Ballard. It's not quite what I'm used to. There is all the urban alienation, but it seems to be mostly, to my mind, a book about relationships, about romantic relationships. I'm actually gonna throw this one an S tier. I love Margaret St. Clair. She is a way underrated writer of mostly short stories. She was a nudist Wiccan. Has just an amazing amount of range. This is a compilation of her short fiction. She also wrote as Idris Seabright, if you ever run into that name. You mostly see her in anthologies, short story anthologies, but if you can find her stuff, I would grab it. It's the only one that I've read from her, but like I said, the range is just amazing. She reminds me in that a lot of C.M. Kornbluth, who is my favorite of the Golden Age writers, because he would write these short stories that were like little novels. They weren't like other short story material from that time that, at least to my mind, don't really age all that well because they're too gimmicky. He didn't really do that, and she especially does not do that. She seems to not care whatsoever about like narrative payoff, which sounds like a flaw, but she'll just write these stories in a seemingly kind of improvised way until she seems to get bored, and then she'll just cut the thread, which is pretty funny and refreshing, at least for me, having gotten tired of the twist ending in older genre short story work. She also was capable of great depth and also of actually funny humor writing, which is the rarest of all of the table of elements. Is actually funny humor, especially in material that's had that much time to, you know, go rancid. There's a couple stories in here that are as weird as anything from Cordwainer or Smith or PKD. Female Man by Joanna Russ. Joanna Russ, I would have to say probably top 3 best prose writers in all of genre fiction. She is virtually untouchable in my mind. There are just a vanishingly tiny number of people who could write at her level. Female Man is her most famous book, arguably her masterpiece, and I'm not really going to argue. If you start reading it, and once again, you don't know what is going on, keep reading because it becomes clear with time. Give it time. Supercon by J.G. Ballard. I think if I had to render an answer of my favorite Ballard, it would be Supercon. Could be considered science fiction, could be considered crime fiction. I don't really care. Book from 2000 about the changing workplace culture and shifting values around productivity and the relationship between employer and employee. Just an amazing, brutal, harrowing, and philosophically really quite meaningful book. Echo Round His Bones by Dish, going into the stacked B tier. It is his first full novel, I believe. No, it is not. It's his second full novel. Nope, it is his third full novel. It's about teleportation. If you teleport your body, it creates a double, a ghost double in an alternate dimension that lives its own autonomous life. What would you do if you were teleported and you found yourself besieged by the teleportation ghosts of murderers? Pretty cool premise. It's violent in a way that is, I think, a little bit less insane than a lot of Dish books. I like it more than Puppies of Terror. I'm not doing the thing where I rank, linearly in the tiers, but I would prefer this one to this one. Third Eye by T. Lobsang Rampa. Book written by a British plumber who is, asterisk, allegedly pretending to be a Tibetan Lama. Makes up a bunch of shit about Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism and conned a generation. This book sucks. Co-read this with Sean of SF Ultra. I'll put a link to that episode down below. Game Players of Titan by Philip K. Dick. Another potboiler. It's like Dick is two completely different writers. He's either putting out stuff like Man in the High Castle and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep that are these eternal, timeless, untouchable classics, and then he just writes bullshit like this. This is Dick firing on all of the Dick cylinders. It's all of the big tropes, and they're all smashed together and then smashed in your face. An example of him needing to calm down, I think. Conan, C for Conan. I like the weird fiction elements, I like the cosmic horror elements, the wish fulfillment does not connect with me. A lot of this stuff squicks me out. It's got a lot of problems, I'm not going to relitigate it. It's just not my kind of thing. Soviet Science Fiction is a collection edited by Isaac Asimov. It has actually a great introduction by Asimov that is one of the highlights of the book. The other bits of it, I think, just are not as good. The first story is really a novella called Hoity Toity by a writer named Belyaev, who is described as the Russian Jules Verne, who I had never read before, about an elephant that seems to be able to understand English and communicate with people. Thought it was really corny and boring at first, and then it got under my skin, and I was rooting for the elephant. That's a pretty good story. It's got a Strugatsky story in there that's interesting just because it foresees like ethical questions around AI. The story itself, I don't know, not that good. And then the rest of it is either like new age pseudoscience writing or just really boring, dry material, like hard SF material. The Eye of the Lens by Langdon Jones. Langdon Jones was a co-editor of New Worlds along with Michael Moorcock. And he didn't have a whole lot of creative output. Most of it, I think, is collected in this book. Most of it is not that good. Most of it is rather pretentious. The highlight is a sequence of stories called The Hall of Machines or Hall of the Machines. It's very Kafkaesque. The final story called Garden of Delights actually got New Worlds banned in Australia because it takes what we will call a big risk. I don't know that I really like Jones's writing all that much. I think this is mostly skippable. Moderan by David R. Bunch. S tier, tough one to describe. Post-apocalyptic stories about warring cyborgs who rule these keeps that launch nukes at each other in this plastic wasteland. Written in this crazed, frenetic, Seussian prose. Bunch is a really obscure figure. I very much want to find other material from him and read it because this is one of the most interesting books I've ever read. Return of the King by Tolkien, pretty good. Two Towers is my favorite bit of Lord of the Rings. I think I like The Hobbit more than Lord of the Rings. It's very interesting reading Lord of the Rings at the same time, roughly, you know, as I'm reading this sort of stuff and weird fiction, stuff like The Nightland by Hodgson, because I think that reading colors how I read Lord of the Rings. Reading this as part of that tradition or as something that's adjacent to those sorts of books and informed by them, which I think it was. I think Tolkien drew influence from a lot of these people. I think it enriches the experience. Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo is a Mexican novel from, I think, the 1950s. It's one of the most famous novels ever to come out of Mexico. I think people categorize it as magical realism, although I think it precedes magical realism. It's a rather avant-garde and difficult and symbolic piece of fiction that's like a ghost story. It's a short book, arguably almost novella length, but it took me a long time to read because it's difficult. Another one that's really rewarding. I think that this is quite a beautiful book. Another memoir, Lemmy's memoir. Lemmy's a Scottish comedian who is, I think at this point, just hands down my favorite comedian. He did sketch comedy on the BBC for many years. That's some of the best sketch comedy ever. Now he's a Twitch streamer. Not just my favorite comedian in terms of the output and the material, but I think my favorite person in comedy. He has this way of writing where it's not trying to be funny, it's not trying to be poetic or profound or meaningful. He's not self-mythologizing at all. In fact, arguably he's almost doing the opposite of trying to strip a lot of the glamour and the halo effect off of his own celebrity and present himself as just sort of this guy who had a lot of very serious struggles growing up and writes with an amount of candor about difficult and embarrassing parts of his life that I don't think most people would ever be able to marshal the courage to do. One of my favorite nonfiction books, I think. This is one of my favorite memoirs ever. It's not high literature, but there's something that's pretty special. It's a clear signal. It's honest, but it's not confessional. Chronicles by D.G. Compton is a recent read. There's one proviso, which is it gets into sexual territory that is rather difficult. It's a satire of late 60s free love, but I think just to characterize it as that is to rob it of its depth and complexity. Very obscure book that most people do not like. Considered and also ran. This is up there with a lot of the Ballard material that I've read, and I think it stands not quite toe-to-toe maybe with the Mortenhoe, but it's not that far behind. It wouldn't be insane to put it in the same conversation as a slight runner-up to this and to Farewell, Earth's Bliss. In Quest of Candlelighters by Kenneth Patchen. He's a poet who was one of the architects of beat poetry, and I think the source material is better than Kerouac and Ginsberg. Very important person to me, and I still really resonate with his view of the world. Midworld by Ellen Dean Foster, an old favorite that sucks ass. This was on the first top 15 as the first book, number 15, and reread it for the first time since I was a kid, and yeah, it's pretty bad. Red as Blood by Tanith Lee. Give it an A. No, we won't. We'll give it a B. The Final Story, which is a science fiction retelling of Beauty and the Beast, is phenomenal. Such a good book, story rather. Feels like reading a book. There's a couple other stories in here that are really good. These are Tanith Lee's retellings of fairy tales from different traditions around the world. Tanith Lee is one of the only authors still who I've never read a book from that I disliked. The two of them by Russ, I think, would be the only Russ book that I would put in the A tier. I've now read 4 of her 5 science fiction novels, and I think this is my least favorite of them. It is her final science fiction novel. She went on to write one non-genre novel and then pivoted just to doing nonfiction. It's still an amazing book, especially the final couple chapters where her narrative technique shifts. Last Hurrah of the Golden Horde by Spinrad. covered this in the top 5 worst books I've read this year video that came out, I think 3 months ago or so. There's a couple short stories in there that are decent. So that probably was unfair. We'll put it at D. There's just some material in here that I find unbelievably obnoxious. And finally, Strange Relations by Philip Jose Farmer. I'll actually put it C because the first 2 stories I still think are really, really good. Mother and Daughter are the titles. Those are stories about these weird aliens that are like limpets that lure prey up to the tops of hills where they perch to be drafted into their reproductive process inside of their shells. It's really weird stuff. Pretty good though. The rest of it can kick rocks. So I don't know what the final end of year wrap up total is going to be, but this is about on pace for me. This is about how much I apparently read in a year every year. I'm slightly surprised. I thought that there would be more up here, but this isn't bad. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.